This Thursday, I had my homily all set to go. And then the course of human events intervened. And I awoke very early on Friday realizing a completely different homily was now needed. In this holy month of Ramadan, our nation launched an attack on a nation that is primarily Muslim, an act of violence that has been deemed immoral both by Pope Leo and by our U.S. bishops. And even according to the old just war theory, this war doesn't pass muster. And then related to this war, Temple Israel, right in our own backyard in West Bloomfield, was attacked. The perpetrator, driven over the edge by grief and despair, as we now know that Israeli missiles killed his family in Lebanon. The attack on Temple Israel does have a personal connection for me because a good friend of mine works there. He normally does not work on Thursdays, and I didn't think he was working, but that didn't stop me from frantically trying to call him for 45 minutes while he was frantically calling and texting his fellow workers to find out if they were okay. And of course, as we know, fortunately, everyone except one security officer who was injured and the perpetrator himself were okay. O children of Abraham, Jews, Christians, Muslims, may peace be on all of us. Today's gospel can be understood on many different levels. But one of those levels is the question of interreligious relationships. Scripture scholars, looking at this 9th chapter of John, will tell us that it explains the separation of Christians from Judaism. We have to remember that for about 2 generations, Christianity was simply part of Judaism. Christians worshiped together with Jews in their synagogues. That's why our liturgy to this day bears some close resemblance to synagogue worship. But in a relatively short period of time between the preaching of St. Paul, proclaiming that Jewish laws and customs were not binding on Christians, together with the influx of Gentile, that is, non-Jewish converts to Christianity, that situation of Christians remaining as part of Judaism simply was no longer tenable. As we listen to the story, we recognize how the blind man's gradual movement to faith in Jesus parallels that of any convert. First, he understands Jesus simply as a man. Then he sees him to be a prophet and finally proclaims him to be Lord. And of course, at that point, he is bodily thrown out of the synagogue. It is an action of excommunication. It is the expulsion of Christians from the synagogue. Now, before we get overly self-righteous about that and all anti-Semitic, you need to know that in the Gospel of Matthew, it goes the other way around. According to Matthew, we did not get kicked out. We chose to leave Judaism. And I think both versions are probably accurate. There was no great organization, there was no mass media. So the separation of Judaism and Christianity probably happened in these various relatively small localities in different ways and different times throughout that middle part of the first century, until finally, by the late first century, we now have two distinct faith traditions: Jews, Christians, Muslims. We are very close to one another. Just how close can be experienced in those times when we acknowledge our dependence on God rather than trying to do it all ourselves. Just how close can be experienced when we acknowledge God's boundless grace rather than trying to control and manipulate God. Just how close can be experienced when we work together on behalf of people in need. And when we work together seeking justice and peace. And that is precisely what makes the conclusion of today's gospel so poignant. If we simply hear this 9th chapter of John as an ironic play between sight and blindness, we miss the stark loneliness of that final scene. It is something so filled with pathos that it could come to us out of Rod Sterling's Twilight Zone. I mean, put this image in your head. Really try to imagine this. In that closing moment, Jesus and the man who can now see are conversing outside the synagogue. Picture that synagogue maybe 30, 40 yards behind them. And I think that image helps us to understand how deep of tragedy this really is. And we wait upon our God to write a new ending. An ending in which the spiritual descendants of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar not only accept one another, but cherish, celebrate, admire, and learn from our diverse expressions of faith.